name is Lauren, and I am very happy to welcome you to this virtual experience with One World Observatory. So this event is part of Tiqets Save The Date, an online series of events to help you rescue romance this Valentine's weekend. And before we hand over to our host for this experience, we're going to take care of a few logistics. So if you have any questions for our host, you can submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to send us your questions, and we're going to try to answer as many of them as possible at the end of the session. You can also upvote your favorite questions by giving them a thumbs up, and we'll aim to ask the questions with the most votes first. This is a Zoom webinar, so your camera won't be on, but you can use the chat to communicate with your fellow attendees and with the presenters. You can share where you're joining us from, your reactions during the session, all by using the chat. Just make sure you're messaging all panelists and attendees. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat to send a message just to all panelists, and we'll try to help you out as soon as possible. If you have any trouble with audio, sometimes just leaving and rejoining is an easy fix. And finally, this experience is going to be recorded, and you'll be able to watch all our Save the Date experiences on Facebook Live for the whole of this Valentine's weekend. And we'll be sending recordings of the experiences to all of the registrants in the coming weeks as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our presenter for this experience, Mike, and he is going to transport us to the world of New York skyline and the history of New York. Mike, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Lauren. My name is Michael Michonne, and here I am. You can see I am virtually in Central Park in the heart of Manhattan. Over my shoulder with this one is the Romeo and Juliet statue right outside the Dela Court Theater, where the free Shakespeare in the Park happens in the summertime here in New York City, a New York institution. And I figure what better icon to represent what I'm going to be calling romance, relationships, and love in New York City for my presentation. So I'm going to jump my screen here because my slides are prettier than I am, I think. And okay, so my name is Michael Michonne. I am what's known as a tour ambassador captain at One World Observatory at One World Trade Center in New York City. I am the former Manhattan Borough historian, and I'm proud to say I am a native New Yorker. So we're going to be sort of taking a little tour of New York City from the sky, from the observatory. And I'm going to point out, in addition to many landmarks telling you stories, hopefully you're not familiar with, I'm going to also talk about, like I said, romance, relationships, love, a couple of interesting, fun tidbits about those topics related to New York City. So why don't we make believe we're actually visiting the observatory, take a little walk through to the top of the building. So here's a flyby of the top, and we can see the observatory from this flyby. Gives you a sense of where we are in Manhattan. We are in Lower Manhattan. We have breathtaking views, not just of the 5 boroughs of New York, but also New Jersey. We can see 41 miles. Now here's my colleague, Emma, who is going to sort of be our guide to the top. And we're going to follow her, give you the experience as if you had purchased a ticket and we're visiting the observatory. And we hope you will come to the observatory, purchase a ticket, and do this for real. You have to go down to go up at One World Observatory. Now, of course, we're practicing all sorts of precautions in this era of COVID-19, social distancing, and we take a temperature check. This is my colleague, Lois, who is a little aggressive here with the thermometer, but you can't be too careful, I say, right? And so this is typical. Emma's going to pass through the security gates and come to our welcome wall. And here's where we count off every visitor. And since we opened the observatory back in 2015, we've had almost 11 million visitors from around the world. And we count every one of them. And tally it up on the welcome wall. This is one of my favorite new features of the observatory. It's kind of a history wall. This is a multimedia presentation that highlights the important historical events that took place in our neighborhood. Downtown Manhattan is the most historic part of New York City. It was where New York City began, where the first Dutch settlers arrived in the 1600s. Then it's into the elevators, our famous elevators. Riding an elevator at One World Observatory is like riding in a time machine. You watch the city develop over 400 years from the first Dutch settlers to the present day. This whole ride takes less than 50 seconds. And of course, once we're at the top, the building is built to greet us. And we come out at floor 102. There's one more multimedia presentation, which I say gets you in the mood for learning about New York City. This is contemporary New York. And this lasts about 2 minutes. This is the abbreviated version. And as it concludes, you're faced with the city in reality. A breathtaking reveal. So let's get a sense of exactly where we are. Take sort of a bird's eye view of lower Manhattan, and you'll notice in this tangle, this forest of skyscrapers, in the left middle is our building. That's One World Trade Center. And to give you a sense of what this building is all about, here we have a profile of the building. Now, One World Trade Center is an office building, just like the original Twin Towers were, just like most of the other World Trade Center buildings, which we'll be talking about later on in the tour. You'll notice up near the top of the building, there is the observatory. It's sandwiched between what are called mechanical floors, the roof mechanical and the upper mechanical. Those are basically equipment floors. The observatory is 3 levels, floor 100, floor 101, floor 102. The very top of the building is the same height, the same rooftop height as the original Twin Towers. And that's not a coincidence, that's not a random thing. The designers of One World Trade Center wanted the memory of the Twin Towers to be part of this building. So they matched the rooftop height and they matched the dimensions of the footprint, the base of the building. So I tell people, if you weren't alive to see the Twin Towers, or you weren't in New York City to ever see them in person, and you want to have a sense of what they look like, look at this building, look at our building. Same rooftop height, same base dimensions. Of course, the walls are shaped differently, but those other important dimensions are the same. The observatory itself is located on the 100th floor. If you look at this diagram, you'll see that we are at a height of 1,254 feet, which, by the way, is 4 feet higher than the rooftop of the Empire State Building. If you're into meters, that works out to 382 meters. Now, I mentioned the rooftop height matching the height of the Twin Towers, but that is not where our building ends. We keep going. Above our roof is a spire. It is not an antenna like most people think. I tell people, think of our spire like the steeple on a church. It's part of the building. It completes the building. So the official height of the building is the height of the spire, 1,776 feet, 1776, the birth date of the United States, and another symbolic height. And that works out to 541 meters. That makes us the tallest building in New York City, the tallest building in the United States, and the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. But the sixth tallest building in the world. Over in the Eastern Hemisphere, there are 5 taller buildings. So let's look out the windows. This is the view looking south from the observatory, from the 100th floor. And the thing that sort of overwhelms you is the amount of water. You are looking at New York Bay. New York is one of the best natural harbors in the world. And it makes it the perfect place to trade by ship on the East Coast of the United States. And trading by ship has driven the economy of New York since the earliest days, since the days of the Dutch. And that continues to this day. In the distance, toward the middle left, you see the famed Verezano Narrows Bridge. This bridge connects the borough of Brooklyn on the left to the borough of Staten Island on the right. The Verezano Narrows Bridge is the longest suspension bridge in the United States. It is huge. It is so big. It is so big that if you were to take a measurement of the base of those towers and compare it to the measurement, the distance between the base of the towers, and compare it to the distance between the tops of the towers, the distance at the top would exceed the distance at the bottom by about 1 5/8 of an inch. And that's because of the curvature of the earth. Now, a lot of people don't know what I'm talking about. Let me have a little explanation here. So if you were to build 2 towers right near each other, this is sort of an oversimplified schematic. If you were to build 2 towers relatively short next to each other, right next to each other, for all intents and purposes, they would be parallel, right? But if you made them taller and then stretched them out wide, you can see that the distance at the top doesn't match the distance at the bottom. The distance at the top for the towers of the Verezano Narrows Bridge, like I said, about 1 5/8 of an inch wider, further apart than the distance at the base. There's a little New York City civic engineering trivia for you. Looking further into the bay, we notice 2 very famous landmarks. Of course, the Statue of Liberty on the left and Ellis Island on the right. The Statue of Liberty was a gift from the people of France to the United States. They wanted us to have a birthday present. I mentioned earlier that the United States was born in 1776. Well, they wanted us to have a 100-year birthday present. They wanted to present us with this statue in 1876. They felt that the United States was an example of growing democracy in the world. Slavery had been abolished recently, and they thought that we would be a shining example to the old world. And so that was the whole idea of the statue. It's called Liberty Enlightening the World. And in this image, you can see that the statue is hollow. She is made of copper, a thin sheet of copper about the thickness of 2 pennies stacked on top of each other. And inside is a now it's steel, it used to be iron, skeleton that supports the weight of the outer shell. Now, here's the thing. The statue part was the gift. That came from France. That was free. But you'll notice she stands on this stone pedestal. And that was not free. It was up to us Americans to basically pay for and build the pedestal before the statue could go on top. And in the 1870s, the United States government was in a recession. It didn't want to spend any money. It was too cheap to pay for the pedestal. So there wasn't any money to build that pedestal. Finally, it was left up to ordinary people, ordinary Americans, donating money, nickels, pennies, dimes, dollars, to get that pedestal built. We call this today, of course, crowdfunding. It was a brand new concept back then in the 1870s, 1880s. And because it took so long to get these contributions, the statue was delayed. She was eventually completed not in 1876, but 10 years later in 1886. But I like to say she was worth waiting for, right? The other landmark in our view is Ellis Island. Ellis Island is the square-shaped island to the right. Ellis Island served as the immigration processing center for 12 million immigrants coming into the United States to be citizens of the United States. This was between 1892 and 1954. It's estimated that 1 in 4 Americans can trace at least one branch of their family tree through Ellis Island. Now, of these millions who arrived, most of them did not settle in New York City. So many of them, like my grandparents, did, but more, about 2/3 of that 12 million number, did not. And they had friends, family, and jobs elsewhere in the United States. And the way they could get to those people and places was by heading to our next landmark a little bit to the right of of Ellis Island. This structure you see here, this is the New Jersey Central Railroad Terminal. This is one of several railroad terminals on the shore of New Jersey where trains would stop and take people and send them to all different cities all across the United States. I like to say that those immigrants, they would come to that building, they'd buy a ticket, they'd get on a train, and they'd go fill up the United States. All right, now let's swing our view to the north. And this, of course, I call this the money shot. This, of course, is the famous skyline of Manhattan. But I have to tell you, working at the observatory, so many times when I show the people this view and I point out on the left the Hudson River, which separates Manhattan from New Jersey on the other side, the first question they ask is, where did Sully land the plane? Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, let's wind the calendar back to 2009, when an airplane took off from LaGuardia Airport, which is way over to the right in Queens, and it was heading to Charlotte, North Carolina. And as it was flying around northern Manhattan, it hit a flock of birds, geese. They disabled the engines. The plane couldn't keep flying. The pilot, his name was Chesley Sullenberger, everyone calls him Sully. He made the quick decision that in order to save all those people on board, he would have to land that plane in the middle of the Hudson River. This, of course, is called a miracle on the Hudson, and everybody wants to know, where did Sully land the plane? Well, that's where Sully landed the plane. If you look at my arrow up in the distance to the left, you'll see the plane came down at approximately 47th Street, 48th Street. If you want to get an up-close look at the exact spot, head over to the Hudson River and make your way to the Intrepid Pier. The Intrepid is, of course, the aircraft carrier museum on the Hudson River. Right about there is where the plane came down. Now, Captain Sullenberger did such a good job of landing the plane. There were very few injuries, only one real serious injury. There were no fatalities, and everybody basically was able to get out on the wings of the airplane to be rescued. And here those folks are being picked up by local ferry boats to save them. Now, what you can't tell from these, from my narration, is how cold it was. This was a January day. The temperature was about 20 degrees, which I think is about the temperature today in New York City. To give you a sense of how cold it was, look on the left side of this image, hanging off the boat, you'll notice icicles. So if you really want to get a sense of what it was like to be on the Miracle on the Hudson, go outside right now, head over to the Hudson River, take off your jacket and walk out into the ice water. And that's what it was like for these folks. So back to our money shot, back to our view to Midtown Manhattan. And I want to point out a landmark here. Everyone has heard of this place. And since it's a little difficult to see by description, I'm going to circle it. There we go. With that blue circle. Down there in among the buildings is a place you've all heard of. Chances are, if you've visited New York, you've been there. I'm talking about Times Square. And that's where our first sort of story of relationships and romance takes place. But let's do a little history of Times Square first. This is Times Square as it looked like back in 1908. Uh, the name Times Square was relatively new at the time. For generations, this intersection of 42nd Street and Broadway was called Longacre Square. And then the New York Times, the newspaper, built that tall, slender building with the flag on top at the intersection. And when they did that, the city basically decided to rename Longacre Square and name it after the newspaper. So it's called Times Square. Now, that building does not look familiar to you if you've seen Times Square in modern times, because that fancy, fussy facade has basically been stripped off over the decades, replaced with billboards, so that the building is basically covered top to bottom with billboards today. And that, of course, is the building where the famous ball drop takes place every New Year's Eve. When the New York Times built this building back in 1904, they wanted to have a big New Year's Eve celebration. They shot fireworks off the top of the building. And they did that for a few years until the city said, this is not a smart idea. There are lots of folks gathered below with ashes falling on their heads. There are wooden buildings all around. And so they stopped the fireworks. The Times reverted to this idea of the ball drop. That's been going on since 1907. And Times Square has become what people call the crossroads of the world. It is the place where basically New York City, and some might even say America, celebrates important events. And none more celebratory, more important than what is known as VJ Day. Back in 1945, when World War II ended, of course, the Germans surrendered first, but the war continued. The Japanese vowed to fight to the very last man, child, and woman, basically, until the US dropped 2 atomic bombs. And then finally, Japan surrendered. And the city went wild, right? And in no place more than Times Square. And during this massive celebration of humanity, a very famous photo was taken of a sailor embracing what appeared to be a nurse. A photographer was on hand to snap this shot. It was published in Life magazine, and this image has become one of the most iconic images of the period. When you ask people of a certain age to sort of encapsulate iconically the joy of VJ Day, this is the image that most people, 9 times out of 10, this is what people will remember, will evoke. Now, by the way, it should be mentioned that this is not the only image of this moment. The photographer took several shots, and another photographer also took a shot of this kiss, this famous Times Square kiss. But this is considered to be sort of the best one. It's a full-length shot. It's got the best balance all around, captures the people's expressions all around. This is the one that got published. This is the most famous one, but there are other versions out there. The fellow who took the photo was a relatively famous and acclaimed photographer. His name was Alfred Eisenstadt. And in 1995, this is him signing pictures of the famous photo. And he was asked about the circumstances of taking the picture. And he said, I was walking through the crowds on VJ Day looking for pictures. I noticed a sailor coming my way. He was grabbing every female he could find and kissing them all, young girls and old ladies alike. Then I noticed the nurse standing in that enormous crowd. I focused on her. And just as I'd hoped, the sailor came along, grabbed the nurse, and bent down to kiss her. Now, I will say right now, as a disclaimer, don't do this. This is inappropriate behavior, okay? But this is how that photograph came to be. Now, the question was, who are these people, right? The image was published in Life magazine, and nobody gave too much thought to it until people really, really, really started to love this image. It became very, very popular, and Life magazine wanted to know who the subjects were, who was the man, who was the woman, and they put out a call, but they got no response. Nobody claimed to be either of the participants. But then over the decades, people started appearing, claiming to be either the sailor or the nurse. And to give you an idea of how fraught this mystery was, we had at least 2 candidates for who the woman was. And I don't know, I haven't even counted, maybe about a dozen guys with probably more than that's on this list of possible men in the photograph. And that's really where the mystery was. People didn't know who these people were, and everybody was claiming it's me, it's me, it's me. Well, people have done relatively extensive research, forensic research, interviews, photographs, comparisons, all sorts of clues were sifted through to find out who these people were. We still don't know definitively, absolutely, positively who they were, but the likeliest candidates for the woman, a woman by the name of Greta Zimmer Friedman, and for the man, George Mendonça. And it seems that these are the 2 candidates, the 2 likely people. And here's what they looked like, approximately the time of the photograph. And here's what they looked like in 1980 for a reunion that Life magazine sponsored. We get a sense of how this photo came to be. Turns out that Greta was not a nurse. She was actually a dental assistant. And basically dental assistants dressed like nurses back then. That's why she was wearing that outfit. George was a sailor in the Pacific on leave. He was actually on a date, believe it or not, with his future wife. But when he heard the news about the war ending, he just went into this kissing frenzy, right, of joy, because he wouldn't have to go back and, fight in the Pacific. And so, he eventually grabbed Greta. The photo was taken, and Greta was interviewed. And don't want to put too much cold water on George here, but she said it wasn't much of a kiss. It was more of a jubilant act that he didn't have to go back and fight in the war. Okay, so back to our northern view, we at the observatory get to observe some pretty impressive atmospheric effects. And just this December, we had a really, really amazing day in terms of the clouds. I snapped the following picture. Now I want you to keep your eye on the image you're looking at right now as we transition to this image. I'm going to take it back again because I love transitioning. Isn't that cool? So we were literally above the clouds when this was taken. Now, the thing that strikes me as a tour ambassador at the observatory is that when I first started working at the observatory back in 2015, if I were to encounter this same situation with these low-lying clouds, this same exact atmospheric situation, I would only see in 2015 one building, the Empire State Building, which is the pointy building, the big pointy building to the right, in sort of the middle right of this image. And now it's 2021, only 6 years later, and look at all of those buildings that have popped up. New York City is experiencing a building boom in Midtown Manhattan like never before. And to illustrate that, we put together this colorized image of the view looking north. All of those yellow colorized buildings you see were constructed from 2016 to 2019. I lived in New York my whole life, never seen anything like this. It is unbelievable. And many of those buildings up on or near 57th Street are super luxury condominium towers, either entirely condominiums or partially condominiums. And real estate people are starting to call, not starting to call, they do call 57th Street Billionaires Row. Billionaires Row. Our next story of relationships and romance takes place way uptown. If you look in the distance across the Hudson River, you'll notice that gray bridge. That's the George Washington Bridge, the busiest automobile bridge in the world. And our story takes place just a little bit north of that bridge in northern Manhattan. And the time period is way back during the Revolutionary War. Now, let's do a little sort of background here about the Revolution. The Revolution was not a good time to be in New York City. The rebellion was beginning, and Britain wanted to put an end to this very quickly. And their strategy was basically to capture New York and to capture the Hudson River. And if they could capture the Hudson River, they could divide the colonies, the New England colonies from the mid-Atlantic and the southern colonies, and basically implement a strategy of divide and conquer. And in order to do this, to put this strategy into effect, they sailed dozens of warships into New York Harbor with 40,000 men. 40,000 men. You would not see an amphibious attack force as large as this until you got to World War I. It was incredible. Waiting for this force in Brooklyn was George Washington's army. So here we see the British ships sailing into New York. And here's a map of New York City, what is now New York City, and the surrounding area. And the British attacked George Washington's forces, like I said, in Brooklyn, in the largest engagement of the war. And it did not go well for the Americans. After the Battle of Brooklyn, Washington's army was chased to the island of Manhattan. They engaged the British again in the Battle of Kips Bay, and again in Harlem Heights, and again in Pelham Bay, and again in White Plains. And it was obvious to Washington and the American forces that this would not go well. And Washington decided to basically abandon New York City, head over to New Jersey and live to fight another day. However, they, in an effort to sort of hold the Hudson River, Washington's forces set up what was called Fort Washington at the northern end of Manhattan. This was kind of like the last stand in New York City. And surrounding Fort Washington would be various American defenses, like you see the one labeled here. Now, there was a British soldier stationed across the Harlem River to observe what happened next. And so he drew this sketch, which kind of points out the action. You'll notice here, I'm gonna show you, there's Fort Washington right in the middle in the distance. Those defenses I mentioned are over on the hill to the right. And you'll notice in the water, there are these boats with the attacking British soldiers. And to the very right, you'll see a ship in the Hudson River, which is across the island, and some forces. Those are the Hessian forces that are allies of the British. They're going to attack those American defenses to try to capture Fort Washington. Now, those American defenses were manned by a number of soldiers. Among them was a man by the name of John Corbin. John Corbin was a Virginia farmer, and he married a woman by the name of Margaret Corbin, who was from Pennsylvania. She was an orphan. Her parents actually had been kidnapped and killed by Indians. She married John. John joined the army, and Margaret followed John into the army. Now, this was not terribly uncommon. Women would perform support roles. They wouldn't do the fighting, but they would tend to the injured soldiers, and they would mend their clothes, and they would help out on the battlefield where they could. And as the engagement took place, John's team, who were manning a gun, what most people would call a cannon, right, came under fire by the enemy, and he was killed. Now, Margaret, who was nearby with her husband, did not abandon her husband, did not abandon her post. And in fact, she jumped in to do his job. And she became part of the gunnery team. And they continued to fire on the enemy. Now, this battle did not go well for the Americans, like so many of these battles in New York City. And eventually, the gun battery was overcome by the Hessians. Here you see an illustration of Margaret. She was struck in the shoulder, in the breast, and in the jaw. So she was injured, but she was not killed. Eventually, the British overcame Fort Washington. It was a terrible defeat. A colleague of mine calls it the Alamo of the Revolution. Many prisoners were captured, Margaret among them, but because of her injuries and the fact that she was a woman, she was eventually released. She survived her wounds and eventually became a member of what was called the Invalid Corps. And so basically she continued to serve in a support capacity for the Army. Even after the war, she worked up in West Point. Eventually she passed away, and her heroism was not forgotten. She is considered the first female combat veteran of the United States military. She was the first female combat veteran to receive a pension, a military pension from the government. And her exploits, like I said, have not been forgotten. Up in northern Manhattan, you see various mentions of her. On the far left, there's a plaque on the hill where she and her husband tried to defend Fort Washington. You'll notice if you scroll down to the text, you'll see her name, Margaret Corbin. There's a plaque not far from this bigger plaque devoted to Margaret herself. She's got a street named after her. And in West Point, she's got a grave marker in her memory. Now, this story about Margaret has a great postscript that I love to tell, so I'm going to tell it. In Brooklyn, far away from this battle, there is a street known as Corbin Place. But it is not named for Margaret Corbin. It's named for another fellow, a man named Austin Corbin. And Austin Corbin was the president of the Long Island Railroad. Now, about 10, 15 years ago, somebody who was living on Corbin Place decided, a little history buff, decided to do a little research about the history of his street and found out that Austin Corbin was not a nice man, not at all. He was a member of the American Society for the Suppression of Jews. And he is quoted as saying such ugly things as, if this is a free country, why can't we be free of the Jews? Now, to add insult to injury, the street where Corbin Place, the street of Corbin Place, the residents of Corbin Place were largely Jewish. This was a Jewish neighborhood. And so naturally, there was a movement to change the name of Corbin Place. However, the neighborhood was divided. Lots of people said, oh my goodness, it's going to screw up the mail deliveries. We have to change the signs. It's going to cost money to change business cards and letterheads. It's not worth it. Nobody cares. Nobody knows this guy. Well, as they were trying to figure out what to do, somebody remembered Margaret Corbin. And they said, hey, why don't we do this? We will rename the street for Margaret Corbin. And that's what the city council did. So Corbin Place is no longer named after Austin Corbin, the anti-Semite. It's named after Margaret Corbin, the patriot hero. So huzzah. All righty, let's move our view a little bit to the east. You'll notice there's a waterway in the distance, the near distance. And that, of course, is the East River. Across the East River is another borough, the borough of Queens. Queens is where you'll find many, many ethnic neighborhoods. It's the most ethnically diverse place in the United States. It's where you'll find LaGuardia Airport. You'll also find Kennedy Airport out there. You'll find Arthur Ashe Stadium, where the US Open tennis tournament is held. Here's more of Queens, a little closer look of Queens in the distance across the water. The bridge in front of us, that's the Williamsburg Bridge. And now if we look a little closer at our doorstep from this view, this is the Civic Center. The Civic Center, unfortunately, you can't see City Hall. It's blocked by this tower right in front of us. But City Hall is down there among the trees. Not far is that green-topped building, the Woolworth Building. Used to be the tallest building in the world when it was built back in 1913. Now, if we look further down at our doorstep, so to speak, actually, let me back up a little bit. You'll see the new World Trade Center. And because we are One World Trade Center, where the observatory is, we're often asked about what's going on since the towers came down. So let's have a little comparison. This is what the old World Trade Center, the original World Trade Center, looked like. 7 buildings in a plot of 16 acres of land. World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2 were, of course, the Twin Towers, and surrounding them were 5 shorter buildings. When the towers were destroyed, all of the surrounding buildings were damaged so much that basically they had to be destroyed as well. They were torn down. The new World Trade Center looks like this. Where the Twin Towers used to be are now memorial pools, those blue squares that you see. There are 4 office buildings, soon to be 5. World Trade Center 1, which is our building, the observatory building. To our north is a new World Trade Center 7. Sort of diagonal away from World Trade Center 1 is World Trade Center 4 and World Trade Center 3. There will be eventually a World Trade Center 2 that has not been built. And also under construction is a performing arts center, and completed is what's called the Oculus, or the transportation hub, which is right next to World Trade Center 3. And so when everything is said and done, this is what it will look like. And I'm happy to say most of this is finished. Most of this is finished. The only thing that really has not begun at all yet is World Trade Center 2, which is that sort of stair step building right in the middle of this artist rendering. But everything else is done. And the lower Manhattan is being reborn, thanks in large part, to the new World Trade Center. If we cast our view back to the East River, we'll see one of New York's greatest landmarks, and that, of course, is the Brooklyn Bridge, the brown bridge right in the middle of this image. The Brooklyn Bridge was a monumental engineering achievement. It was built over the course of 14 years, from 1869 to 1883. When it was done, it was considered the 8th wonder of the world. No one in America had ever seen something so big, so grand, so glorious as the Brooklyn Bridge. But it has as you can imagine, a fascinating history, and will take us to another story of relationships and romance. So the Brooklyn Bridge was designed by a German immigrant, a civil engineer by the name of John A. Roebling. He was a very experienced, a very knowledgeable engineer, built quite a number of bridges before the Brooklyn Bridge, and he basically designed the essence of the bridge. But he did not live to see construction begin in earnest. In the very early planning stages of creating the bridge, he was injured. He died from his injuries, and the job of supervising construction fell to his son, a man by the name of Colonel Washington Roebling. Also a trained engineer who, in addition to going to engineering school, trained at the foot, at the knee of his father. So he really knew everything that was necessary to build this bridge. Now, building the Brooklyn Bridge was a very difficult process, and arguably the hardest part, which may strike people when they think about it as being the easiest part, but absolutely was not. The hardest part was building the towers that the cables would suspend from and the roadway would hang from, right? And when you think about it, how do you build those towers in the middle of the river? You can't just pile up granite blocks on the riverbed and expect that to be a firm foundation for a bridge. And so what you need to do is you need to get down beneath the riverbed to the bedrock. And the way you do that is by building a giant wooden box, half the size of a city block. It's called a caisson, right? And the box has an open bottom, sealed top, sealed sides. You float it out to the river, you sink it to the riverbed. So here's a picture of a caisson, right? That sort of box shape, that's the caisson. It's sitting on the riverbed. Let me clarify this a little bit. Let me add some water here. So that's the water, right? Now, what you need to do is you need to get your men inside the caisson, standing on the riverbed. And so in order to do that, what you have to do is you have to pump pressurized air into that caisson so those men can breathe and they can work. And once they're in there with picks and shovels and dynamite, they're going to chip away at the riverbed as the caisson descends. And as it gets deeper and deeper, they're going to pile on concrete blocks on top of the caisson to build the towers. So this is a little bit more of a detailed view. You can see the men at the bottom working away. You see the concrete blocks on top of the caisson. Now, in order for someone to do this, they're going to have to come out of highly pressurized air in the caisson to normal pressurized air in the atmosphere. This is a very dangerous thing. They didn't realize how dangerous it was at the time. Many, many workmen got injured, suffering from what today we call the bends, nitrogen narcosis. Scuba divers are aware of this problem, the bends. And Washington Roebling suffered from this, from going down into the workspace, up into the atmosphere too quickly, too many times. He eventually was basically made infirm from what they called caisson disease. And he could no longer go to the construction site. So here he is looking out his apartment window over in Brooklyn Heights, looking at the progress of the bridge through his binoculars. Now, this was a distressing situation. The chief engineer can't supervise the project anymore. Well, fortunately, Washington had a very reliable helper. As we quote him as saying, he said, "At first I thought I would succumb, but I had a strong tower to lean upon, my wife, a woman of infinite tact and wisest counsel." And that woman was Emily Roebling. Emily Roebling, who was a very intelligent woman, a schooled woman, not a trained engineer, learned everything she needed to know about engineering in order to basically step in and serve as Washington Roebling's surrogate, his right-hand person. And she won everybody over. She was considered to be quite a diplomat, as well as a very smart woman. And when the bridge was finally completed, she had the honor of actually making the first ceremonial crossing across the Brooklyn Bridge. And she was not entirely forgotten. Her achievements were not entirely forgotten. There was an article published in the paper, the New York Times. It says, while so much has been written about the Brooklyn Bridge and those who have had a share either in planning or building it, there remains one whose services have not been publicly acknowledged, A few days ago, the New York papers mentioned that Mrs. Washington Roebling, wife of the great engineer, had driven the first team over the bridge, but they did not state how fitting it was that she should be accorded this honor. Well, I'm happy to say that historians and engineers have not forgotten Emily Roebling's accomplishments and achievements, her contributions. There is a plaque on the bridge that talks about John Roebling, Washington Roebling, and Emily Roebling, and Emily Roebling is the first one listed on the plaque. So check that out on the Brooklyn Bridge. Speaking of the Brooklyn Bridge, you'll go there, you'll see a lot of what they call locks of love. This is a, I don't know if tradition is the right word. This is a practice that apparently began in Paris, where couples, romantically engaged couples, will seal their love with a padlock on the structure of the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, this seems like a sweet gesture, but boy, oh boy, is it an annoyance to the people who have to maintain the Brooklyn Bridge. They really can't stand this. But it must be said that the New York City at least has something of a sense of humor about this problem. Here's a sign that they posted on the Brooklyn Bridge in order to discourage people from attaching any more locks of love. Now, speaking of romantic bridges, New York City was once covered in what they called kissing bridges. This is a tradition that goes back to the 1700s and the 1800s, when couples, romantically attached couples, would cross a bridge here in Manhattan. They would kiss. This was the toll that the man gave the woman for crossing the bridge. And the Morning Chronicle wrote back in 1803, it is the etiquette for every gentleman in company with a lady to salute his fair companion when upon a kissing bridge. The first kissing bridge in Manhattan was this one here at Broadway and Canal Street. This is when Canal Street was a real canal. When approaching a kissing bridge, the impatient maid may purse her lips for payment, right? So what are these kissing bridges all about? Well, Manhattan was settled from the very bottom tip of the island up to the northern end of the island. And before settlement happened, these waterways that you see marked on this map, some of them labeled, crisscrossed Manhattan like veins, right? According to one source, there are 66 miles of streams, over 300 springs, 21 ponds, and salt marshes. Well, as streets and roads sort of climbed up the island, they would cross these streams, and you'd have to build a bridge there, and that would be a kissing bridge, usually somewhere out in the hinterlands where it wasn't too public, a modest little bridge where the lovers can sort of have a smooch, right? Now, some of the kissing bridges I've turned up quickly are Broadway and Canal Street, Chatham Square, 32nd Street west of Fifth Avenue, 33rd Street and Lex, 50th Street and 2nd, 54th Street and 1st, 77th Street and 3rd, and I'm sure many, many, many more. Now, I learned that the last kissing bridge happened to be at 50th Street and 2nd Avenue. Now, I happen to live around the corner from 50th Street and 2nd Avenue. So I thought, wow, wouldn't it be nostalgic, right? To go outside around the corner and to sort of commemorate the bygone kissing bridge out in the street there, maybe get a real couple, right? To actually sort of relive those bygone days. But then when I got out there, I found that, well, 50th Street and 2nd Avenue is not a terribly romantic place these days. So I don't think that's the place you should go if you want to sort of enjoy the thrill of the old kissing bridges of old New York. But if you do want to try to do that, my suggestion is head to Central Park, where I am right now, right here at the Delacorte Theater with Romeo and Juliet behind me. Head to Central Park. We have this lovely, beautiful bridge called Bow Bridge, which in my opinion is the most romantic bridge in New York City, and it's the perfect kissing bridge. So folks, I want to thank you for joining me. That's going to conclude my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was absolutely incredible. We have a ton of questions for you, so I'm going to see how many we can get through. Okay, one of my first ones is, how often does the lift stop halfway up, and how do you resolve that when it happens? I think he's referring to the elevator in One World Observatory.
Hold on one second. I just want to try to get out of my screen here.
Not a problem. We can see you very clearly, just in case that's a concern.
I just don't want. I'm sorry, what was the question?
So the elevator in One World Observatory, I mean, in the One World building, Mark Crossley would like to know how often the lift gets stopped halfway up, and how do you resolve it when that happens?
That is an infrequent problem, but I'll tell you what, it does happen when we have severe winds. You may remember back one of my earliest slides, I showed you that the observatory was sandwiched between what are called mechanical floors, and those mechanical floors require ventilation. So that section of the tower is subject to very strong winds on a very windy day. And sometimes those drafts get into the shafts, and there are sensors when they detect any sort of like movement of the cable or of the car, will slow the cabin down, or in an extreme case, stop it. So it does happen, doesn't happen a lot. I would say a couple of times a year, a couple of times a year, but more so in the windy season, right?
Okay. Another question from Mark: who is the most famous guest you've had visiting One World Observatory?
Now, of course, I've never been there. I haven't been there every hour the place has been open. So I'll just personalize this a little bit.
Sure.
I would say that in terms of sort of like bold-faced name, I would say Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh wow! Okay.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, yeah. So and he was a lot of fun, Yeah.
Great.
I'm sure, and there are many others that either
that was
me
one
or
that you
I
could,
was, the one that I can, who I personally took around. Yeah.
Oh wow! What was he like?
Nice guy.
Okay.
And it was very obvious that he had movie star charisma. I mean, by his size, by his appearance, and by his manner, he just commanded the moment. So
I feel like they say you shouldn't meet your heroes. Maybe this was an occasion where it was okay too.
It was totally okay. Yeah.
Paul would like to know if any future skyscrapers would be built that would be higher than the World Trade Center, or would that not be allowed?
That is certainly allowed.
Okay.
There are some places. I mean, obviously, there are no international rules against something like that. And as I mentioned, there are 5 taller buildings in the Eastern Hemisphere, right? There are likewise no rules that prevent that in the Western Hemisphere or in New York City. And there has been talk, people have speculated building buildings taller than the One World Trade Center in New York City. That has not come to pass yet, but it could. Now, there are places, probably the most obvious example, Washington, D.C., where they do have local rules that prevent certain heights. And that's another, so in Washington, D.C., for symbolic reasons, you can't build taller than the Washington Monument, okay? In New York and other places, there's local zoning, which is really sort of, even though there don't exist current laws, there's thoughts of having rules against certain heights, not for symbolic reasons, not because somebody doesn't want a building to go taller than One World Trade Center. It's just that tall buildings cast long shadows. They have other negative aspects that they ruin the skyline, people say, they block views. So there are zoning reasons for quality of life that are being considered to limit the heights of tall buildings in New York City.
Interesting. And then can you tell us what the spire at the top of the building is for?
It's an architectural feature. It is basically aesthetic. Uh,
Okay.
it's aesthetic. Yeah, it looks, and I tell people it completes the building, just like the steeple on a church completes the structure of a church.
Okay, it's a nice analogy. Brian would like to know, why is it, so it says it's 1,786 feet high on the spire diagram, but the height is supposed to be 1,776 feet.
Right.
So the question is around.
So that actually, everybody always looks at that. They always, I gotta erase that. Yeah. So as required in the United States, probably around the world, tall structures need to have basically a warning beacon, a flashing light to tell airplanes something is here, right? And so that our beacon actually sits like a hat on top of the spire. Okay, so I tell people, just like a hat doesn't make you taller, right? But it's up there, right?
Okay.
And so that beacon is up there, but it doesn't officially make the
Necessarily.
building taller, right?
Okay. Paul would like to know which name came first, New York City or New York State, or if they were named at the same time. Not sure if that's.
Yeah. So New York came with when the British took over from the Dutch. And that was in 1664, I want to say. And of course, so the city was New Amsterdam before the British renamed it New York. And basically, I won't say the state because it was more of a region at the time, was New Netherlands before it too was named New York. So I'm going to say the city came first because famously the British, so the Dutch have settled in New Amsterdam at the bottom tip of Manhattan. And then in 1664, I hope I've got that right, the British send 4 warships into New York Bay. And basically, because they're going to claim the city because Henry Hudson, who sailed for the British, got here first. And so they're going to claim this area for the British. And basically they captured the city without firing a shot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I like to tell people the very first thing they did when they got off the boat is they renamed the place New York. So I would say that since it happened in downtown, it was the city first.
Okay, that's really, I like your interpretation. I think that's a good way to get to the answer. Gabrielle would like to know, where on the Brooklyn Bridge is the plaque in honor of Roebling?
Yeah, I think it's the Brooklyn Tower. If it's not, it's one of the towers, right? It's right up there on one of the towers. I think it's the Brooklyn Tower.
And then I'm going to try and sneak in one more question because I'm aware we're out of time. Can you tell us what your favorite part of the view from One World Observatory is? If you're standing up there and you're looking up, what is your sort of favorite place to look at?
Sure. I would have to say it's the view of the bay, which is kind of the first thing I showed you in my slide presentation. And the reason I say that is because in a way, it's like the view that doesn't get enough credit. I mean, everyone's seen the skyline of Manhattan. I grew up in Brooklyn, so I've seen some of what the outer boroughs look like. But you really don't get to appreciate what the Bay looks like. And as a historian, the Bay is so important. The Bay, New York as a seaport, made New York as a city. We would not be here if New York wasn't as fantastic a seaport as it is. And this is, so that's just sort of like my emotional attachment to that view. But as just a layman, if you look out into the water and just spend, maybe about 15 minutes staring out there, it's just amazing to watch all the activity that you never knew existed because you live on the land. that's happening out there on the water. And so if you want to look at that stuff up close, here, I'll give you a little tip. I mean, it's not like this is a secret, but take a ride on the Staten Island ferry. It's a free harbor cruise. It's a 25-minute trip from the bottom of Manhattan out to Staten Island, 25-minute trip back, and you get to experience that water right there on the water level. And it's magical. It really is magical.
Mike, thank you so much. This has been such an insightful talk. I don't know if you can see the chat, but people have thoroughly enjoyed what you shared with us today. Really, really interesting. Some people asked if they'd be able to watch this again. All of our Save the Date experiences are going to be available on Facebook Live for the rest of the weekend. So if you missed a section or if you want to go back and watch it again, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you especially to Mike and to One World Observatory for this fantastic experience. And have a great weekend and a wonderful Valentine's Day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.